I'm here with Thomas Moore. Thomas, it's so great to have you back on the podcast. Thanks so much for giving me your time.
I'm really glad to be back with you. I enjoyed so much talking to you last time.
Oh, good. Well, I invited you back on the occasion of the release of a new book called Soul Therapy. And I believe you mentioned it at the end of our previous conversation, and I've been anticipating it ever since. And maybe I'd just start by saying thank you for writing this book. It's I'm finding it really great. It's just feels a bit like the kind of mentorship from afar that I was looking for. You know, your writing really helps me focus back in on what is important in the professional therapeutic life, but also the everyday therapeutic relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe if you could just tell us like what led you to write this book at this time.
Well, I was a lot of things. I've been a therapist for 35 years or so, maybe more. Um, so I've been doing this a long time. I wrote Care of the Soul out of my experience of therapy. That was 30 years ago, but it wasn't very practical. It wasn't really wasn't focused on the life of the therapist. And then after that book came out, I was invited to teach on Cape Cod in Massachusetts for 18 years. I taught there. I taught to therapists of all different kinds, psychiatrists mainly, but also other, social workers and medical people, a lot of different people who counsel others. And they came there for their continuing education credits, and I taught them, and I I enjoyed it very much, and thought I learned a lot about the life of the therapist, and so that was one of the reasons I decided to write this book, because I have that experience and it's in me. I don't teach there anymore, but that program doesn't exist anymore. But uh, I felt it was time to write up what my concrete experience of what it's like to be a therapist that might be of use to other people.
Hmm. Yeah, I find it, I'm listening to it now. I find it incredibly practical and relevant. You have a great gift for taking some of these heady concepts and bringing them down to earth. And one of the things I really appreciated about it was your kind of openness in sharing some of your own experience. I heard a bit of Irvin Yalom in there, just that kind of willingness to be open and transparent about what it's like as a therapist. Was he an inspiration to you?
Yes, yes, he was. Yeah, I read a couple of his books uh, before writing this one. I also read Carl Rogers again. I was
Mm.
trained in Rogerian therapy when I was,
Oh.
younger a person, and so I reread some Carl Rogers. I read Yalom because I like the way Yalom especially um, is available to his reader and doesn't hide behind a lot of technical concepts, but is obviously very intelligent about it. So uh, I think that I decided to write this book in a more relaxed fashion. So it worried me a little bit because I'm used to writing quite formally, and I want everything to be correct. I'm very focused on style. In this case, I gave that up to some extent. I wasn't sure what would happen, and even now, I'm not sure about it because I kind of like the more formal essay form. But I hope that people will be able to read this and make it their own more easily.
Hmm. Well, it definitely feels that way to me. And I just really appreciate it. It sounded a lot more like your own personal voice. And I was wondering if that was, a result of where you are now in your life, that, I got the sense that it was just like, all right, you know what, I'm just going to let it all hang out at this point.
I don't know. I really don't know. Uh, I don't know because I've started a new book and it's quite formal.
Or there's the compensation, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't second guess myself about those things. I think the point was I wanted to write to people in a way that they could listen and hear and not be confused or interfered with by being too technical or too formal in style. The other thing about this book that I still don't know the answer to my quandary is at the very beginning, I wanted to write two books. I wanted to write to therapists and I wanted to write to ordinary people, how they could be therapists. I thought it'd make a nice book. I was thinking of the title, The Therapist in You, something like that. But then I thought, well, I'm not going to write two books on therapy. I'm just going to write one. But I want to write to both people. I wonder if I can do it in one book. So I tried it, and I tried to address both people, both the professional therapist and the ordinary person, who, in certain moments, can serve as a listening, uh, factor in someone's life. So that's what I ended up doing, and I try to address each one as I speak, so they know who I'm talking to.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that and how you help the layperson who just wants to be a help to their friends and family or coworkers, how you help them understand some of the more complicated psychological concepts that can be relevant in everyday relationships. So I love that you've brought those together. So it's not two books because I kind of walk in both worlds. I try to have all my relationships be kind of therapeutic relationships, as best I can. Um, one of the terms that you use to help define the role of the helpful friend is anamkara, which is a term that I really love, and I wonder maybe if you could just talk a little bit about that concept.
Yeah, I began hearing that phrase in Ireland. I spent a lot of time in Ireland in my life. I started going there when I was 19, lived there for 2 years. And since then, I've been back countless times, and I have relatives there. So Ireland's a place that is really home to me. I haven't been there now because of COVID in a while. I really miss it. So I heard the term anamkara used by different sorts of people, just ordinary people on the street, and
Hmm.
it's a term that the Irish know quite well.
Hmm.
The Irish, so many of them speak Irish, and so it's very familiar. So as I understand it, and I'm no scholar about it, but as I understand it, anamkara was used especially in the early days of Irish monasticism. I mean, going way back, the Middle Ages. It was used of a special kind of friendship where the person who's a friend is not only a companion and someone you want to be with, but if you are the anamkara, you relate to that person like with some responsibility or some interest in their welfare and their way of dealing with life in the world and they're getting along in the world. So you take that on to I wouldn't want to use the word help. That's not a nice word for that, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more like being a companion that is aware of that need each of us has to get along in life and deal with obstacles. So the anamkara does that. The word means soul friend. So that's I thought that's a pretty good description of what someone is who's a therapist in quotation marks. That's what I use throughout the book. I put it in quotation marks if it's not a professional therapist. And I kind of like that now. I think of friends in quotation marks, therapists in quotation marks.
Yeah,
And
well, when I was listening to it, because I wasn't seeing the text, I was
yeah,
thinking small T therapist versus big T therapist. But
yes, yes, same idea. Yeah, that's right. Same idea. Although I use the word, I mean, just to be technical, I use the capital T therapist for the archetypal therapist in both.
Ah,
In other words, there's something in us that can we can call on within us to do the work. And I would put that as the capital T therapist, really, the kind of the therapist inside of us. I don't like to put it that way. I wouldn't put it that way inside. I really mean like the archetypal, mythic, larger sense of therapist that we take on when we speak that way to people.
hmm. Could you talk about some of the qualities you think that inner therapist has that are essential to the helping relationship or therapeutic relationship?
Well, there are a lot of things. I think one is an interest in human life, a real interest. For me, the word interest is an important word. I think it's one of the erotic words. It means that you have a desire, you have a real deep curiosity about something. So I think if first of all, if you have someone, and there are a lot of, not everybody, but most people seem really interested in exploring what human life is all about and how it works and how we manage it, that kind of thing. Ultimately becomes a philosopher who is supposed to be a lover of wisdom, and wisdom is kind of a knowledge that helps you get along in the world. And that's exactly what I think a good therapist it has. It has wisdom in that sense. So as a philosopher. And the word therapy has been around for a long time, and it emphasizes the care. It's a heart word. It's not a mind word. It's not about analyzing anybody. So
Hmm.
if you want to analyze your friend, you're not doing therapy as far as
Yeah.
I'm concerned. It's a care heart word. If you're caring for your friend, that's the whole point. So I think that's one attitude that's important. Another is that if you have the capacity to hold back on your impulse to give advice or to treat the other person as another version of yourself or try to steer them in your direction instead of their own direction.
Right. The if I was you, this is what I would do.
Yeah, that's
That
right.
impulse, yeah. Well, you're
Yeah.
not me, and I'm not
Or
you.
my advice to you is, that kind of thing. That is really not therapy either. That's not caring for your friend. That's something else. And I've already gotten a little bit of trouble in using the word friend throughout the book.
Hmm.
Um, some psychiatrists have told me that you really can't do therapy with your friend, but they're taking it too literally. I don't mean it that way. I mean a manner of, how would I put it? A style of relationship that's rooted in deep friendship, but is not the same as this is my friend. It's friendship is the way of relating, as opposed to something else. Like it's not business or it's not doctor or something like that. It's not analyst. It's friend basically. And just as, let's say in a marriage, you'd say that if a married couple, if they're really friends, that really helps their relationship. But obviously they're not just friends. There's something else going on there. But friendship is a quality that can be part of the overall relationship. And that's what I mean by friendship in therapy.
Hmm. Do you think that has something to do with Carl Rogers's idea of unconditional positive regard?
I think that has a lot to do with it. Yes, I've never lost that. I still conjure up Carl Rogers when in certain circumstances in therapy, especially when there's a lot of emotion or where things aren't moving at all. I think that Carl Rogers' approach was really very effective. And I studied it like for a couple of years where I had the experts looking over me, looking over my shoulder as I did my work, my practicum, and they would tell me, make sure that I was doing the Rogerian thing right. So I really got that pounded into me in a way, and I like it. I actually like it quite a bit, and I see a close relationship between Carl Rogers and Mr. Rogers, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so I can put that kind of put that kind of a personality at work, and and I like it, but it's not really the main thing I do. The main thing I do is I'm interested in bringing together my background as a Catholic monk, that whole spiritual work I did there, and reading, tremendous reading and spirituality and guidance. And I put together my studies in Jungian psychology, which were quite extensive, and I still continue to read Jung daily. And then my relationship with James Hillman, who developed what he called archetypal psychology. I felt he was the most brilliant of all the psychology people I ever knew. And so I put all that together. And that to me is the main portal for my work. And Carl Rogers is in the background.
Mm. Yeah, when you made that connection to Mr. Rogers, I just had an image of Mr. Rogers tying up his shoes and saying, life's pretty risky, huh?
Exactly.
Before he heads out the door.
Well, he really was a therapist for children and for adults too. I mean, people grew up and they still think about him, those who were able to watch him. And that's one of the really underlying strong points in this book for me is to start using the word therapeutic differently than we normally do, to see that maybe our politicians could speak therapeutically at the right time, not always. And certainly I don't mean pretending to be therapists. That's not the point at all. It's to speak caringly in a way that can help people move ahead and deal with a current obstacle. That's the whole thing. I can imagine doctors talking to their patients with some therapeutic concerns in mind. And almost anybody. I've talked to people in business who are very concerned about their employees, and they would like to be able to talk to them and just give them some encouragement, but they feel they have to be qualified. So I think there's a kind of paranoia at large in the Western world, especially, where people think that they can't talk to somebody seriously because they're not qualified.
Yeah, it's so true. Like everything's been professionalized,
Yeah.
including these roles that for all of human history were just part of our everyday existence. So the shaman or the kind of the pastoral counseling that would happen around a fire or, while we're eating dinner or something.
Well, yes, I also point out the therapeutic role of parents, that they could also become just a tad more sophisticated about how to speak therapeutically to their children. I think it would make a huge difference.
Hmm. You throughout the book, you invoke different Greek gods and goddesses to illustrate different qualities of that therapeutic relationship. And I can't help but notice today is Mercury's day. It's a good day for us to be communicating over the airwaves.
Yes, it is.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of Mercury Hermes in The Therapist?
Sure. By the way, I think, if I'm not mistaken, today Mercury, the planet, is no longer retrograde, which is a good thing. Astrologers think that's pretty good. I don't know, for myself, I kind of like retrograde motion and those things myself. I like going backwards.
Yeah, well, my wife's an astrologer, and she's always pointing out to me how things get dumbed down and simplified in like social media or pop culture, and she always points out the kind of benefit of the retrograde and the true nature of what's happening there. So yeah, there's some subtlety there.
I'd like to hear that. So your question was the role of Mercury or Hermes in the book?
Well, how does Mercury show up in The Therapist in the therapeutic relationship?
Oh, in so many ways. He's not always there. That spirit of Mercury, we're talking about the spirit of Mercury, who was known by the Greeks as Hermes. And he was known for centuries as Hermes the thief. Because according to his story in mythology, the first day he was born, he stole his brother's cattle. and in a very clever way by tying branches to their feet so they couldn't be noticed and backing them out of the pasture. I mean, he's a clever guy.
Right. So
That,
the sticks were on the oxen or feet, so you wouldn't see the footprints.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right. And then backwards so that you wouldn't notice that they had actually been taken out. So it's clever. He's clever. That was the first day of his existence, just born and he did that.
Yeah.
So, and he's funny. He's a funny character. So fun and humor are part of Hermes. I think that's very important in therapy. To me, humor is very, very important.
Really, it's such a kind of serious profession, you know. It's like
I know.
laden with emotion, and we're talking about
I know.
trauma all the time.
I know. But at the same time, I think it's important to have the Hermes point of view there. That gives you some distance on what's going on. Hermes does not get into that Sturm und Drang of the therapeutic heaviness. He's not heavy. He's light. He's got wings in his hat. Hermes has Mercury. He's got these wings. He flies around. He doesn't plot on the ground.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the wings on the hat, I think the phrase "flights of fancy" comes to my mind.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. You're. That's good. Yes, your imagination and your mind are free and are uninhibited and moving. Exactly. So he also wears a traveler's hat sometimes, a big round hat, and showing that he's a traveler. So he's always on the road, and roads are important to Hermes. In fact, for the Greeks, apparently they would put a pile of stones to indicate what road you're on, or that now you're at someone's house. And those were called Herms,
Hmm.
after Hermes. So he was the guidepost. He's the guide. He guides you along. So I think that's important in therapy, obviously, that we can guide to some extent. We know the signposts, we know what to look for, therapists. But we have to have that spirit of Mercury, of Hermes with us. It's not something that we can do out of our own personal knowledge and education. We need that to be able, I think what the therapist has to do is be able to conjure up that spirit of Hermes and bring it into the space of the activity. And that also allows your client to feel that spirit of Hermes, which is not so heavy and where the imagination is always moving and thinking. You're always imagining further and not taking things quite so literally. So all of that helps. That's all part of Hermes. And the lying part is that he is deceptive. And he's a thief and a liar, because when he does steal his brother's cattle, Zeus asked him if he stole them, and he said, "Me, I'm just an infant. I
Yeah.
couldn't."
Who, me, playing the
Yeah.
innocent? Yeah.
So, so I think that that's part of therapy too. You can't take everything at face value. You have to see the trickiness of life. You have to be a little bit tricky yourself. Um, you can't be overly sincere. You have to be sincere to some extent, but that's not the only thing you have to be. You also have to be not so sincere to have Hermes present.
There's
So,
something, just a little pause there. When he says like, "Oh, who me? How could I do that? I'm just a little baby." Well, it's like, well, you're a god, first of all. So, but what that brings up for me is the ability to kind of disown certain things in the context of therapy. So not to take ownership of things, or not to take credit for everything that comes into the therapy. There's something about that in that story.
that's essential. Yeah. I think in the book, I quote poet William Blake. I don't remember his exact words, but it's something like, I'm only the secretary, the authors are in eternity.
Mm.
And I apply that to therapy, that as a therapist, I am only the secretary. The real therapist is in eternity. In other words, at another level and outside of time or outside of what's going on, not human, but a spirit, a quality that if I have a good relationship to that particular quality of life, that spirit, that power in life, then I can then tap into it and bring it into being in the space of the therapeutic place and time. And that spirit can be very therapeutic.
Hmm. What Carl Jung would call like the great third that would show up when we're in that therapeutic mode with
Yeah.
someone else, right?
Well, in his work, in his writing, and by the way, I read his the volume of his collected works on psychotherapy 2 or 3 times before writing this book. It's very good, has a lot of good insights.
Hmm.
And but he always, in his alchemical writings, always says that the work begins and ends with Mercury.
Hmm.
And if you understand that, that's a really striking thing to say, because you might think that therapy would begin and end with some other power, with God, Zeus, something very powerful and serious and weighty. And Mercury, it's a child. It's like saying it begins with the child and ends with Mercury, the tricky thief. And so what goes on there is not easy to pinpoint. And you don't just go into it with your rational mind and try to say, I'm going to now, I've got all my theories, I've got all my techniques, and I'm going to apply them. There's no Hermes in that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I've been reading Hillman's work on Senex and Puer recently,
Mm-hmm.
and seems like there's something of the Puer in the Hermes spirit. And Hillman talks about Puer can be that impulse for us to move toward the new, and to, the beginning of the hero's adventure. Although he would probably bristle at using the word hero.
It's all right. It's problematical, but it's all right.
Well, he didn't like hero or journey, so.
No, so yes, I think it's a bit subtle there. See what happens. We're speaking mythologically now, and Hillman and I, he and I worked very closely together for many years, and he and I, even in our work together, often, and many people working with Jungian psychology work with mythology as a living thing. It's not a piece of literature out there. It's not a collection of stories. It's a living thing. So Hermes is alive in a way. It's part of our world. So I think what Hillman would say there is that we have the stories of Hermes, which give us the basis of our reflection on him. And they start out when he's a 1-year-old, and he's presented as this young figure. So that another word for young would be puer. Puer is a Latin word meaning young person. It could be mainly applied to a boy, but sometimes applied to women. But certainly the idea is that women have a puer, have a little boy inside them as well. Inside of them is not a good phrase, but anyway, so Hermes then in mythology, has a puer quality right from the very beginning. He's a puer figure in mythology. So speaking psychologically then, what we'd be saying is that if Hermes is present, there's a puer spirit present, a particular one that's Hermes-like. Not another kind, not Icarus who flies up to the sun. That's a whole different aspect of puer. But the Hermes puer is this tricky thief.
Well, I can see how Hermes or Mercury would be there at the beginning of that relationship. It's like you're setting out on a journey, impulse toward the new, toward growth, toward expansion, all of that. How does it relate to the end of the therapy?
Well, in one way it relates is that there is no end. That the end is an illusion. It's a fiction as well as the beginning is a fiction, because someone says to you, I'm here for my first experience of therapy. I'm afraid not. Your parents were, I'm sure, therapeutic with you. before. So your therapy is not limited to the professional experience of it. It happens in life. It's an aspect of life. So there is no end and no beginning. Or as they say, Jung often quotes this French medieval song, "Ma fin et mon commencement." My end is my beginning. My end is my beginning. So that, and in an alchemy, you finish one phase of it, and that becomes the first part of the next. When you repeat, you go ahead. So the end becomes the beginning. That's how these things work. And I think it's true in therapy. You have a therapy session with somebody, you spend an hour talking to them. That session is ended. You've concluded talking about that, but that becomes the beginning of the next session you have, and on and on.
Mm.
And so as far as I'm concerned, there's no ending. I never have an ending. I love it. The people I see drift away. I never know if they're coming back, and I like that. I don't want any endings. I don't want them saying, well, that's the end of this. No, I don't think so. And it's certainly not in the end in the sense that from now on, I'm hoping that what I've done with you will keep you alert so that you will continue to be therapeutic the rest of your life.
Mm. I love that. And I really appreciated that perspective as you presented in the book, because it's something I've been thinking about as I become more experienced as a counselor, is dealing with the endings of things, or the, quote unquote, there's your quotes again, the quote unquote endings, and wondering, does there need to be a formal end to this part of the therapy? And my intuition has been, let people drift away and leave the door open in case they want to come back, but don't, I never felt quite right to kind of formalize that. And I know some people say that you should do that, you should have a closure on that part of the therapy or whatever. But, so it's been a question in me, and I've just been following my intuition with it. Is like you said, just let people drift away, and then sometimes they drift back a few months later, a few weeks later or something. Maybe they never do. But I kind of like that openness, and I get this image of all of these people I've been connected to intimately, who just maintaining that connection to them. And if they follow that thread back, wonderful. If not, wonderful.
That's right. So the ending is not, you just don't take it literally. You can have an ending, but it's not literal. It's not actual. And I get that from music, because I often refer to music in this question, because I'm trained in music theory. And in music, any song, you have a part of the song where you come to what they call a cadence. It means it just sort of slows down or comes to a bit of an end. But that's not, then it picks up right away. Almost any song does that. It's like waves, little waves.
Yeah, they're like punctuation at the end of a
They're
sentence, or
punctuations. But then often there's a big punctuation at the end. In concert music, there might be a huge, drums and cymbals and everything coming down in a crash at the end. They want to make sure it's over. Because
you
the
can get
other,
up and leave now.
yeah, that's right. The other endings were provisional. So that's the way I understand the ending in therapy. It's provisional. It's a cadence. It's not the final cadence. The final cadence, I don't know if that will be. I don't even know if there is a final cadence ever, but who
Yeah,
knows?
maybe we'll be doing therapy in the next world or
Who
something.
knows?
We'll have a big group therapy. Oh, that's great. Because you do blend the professional and the everyday therapy that's possible, I think it'd be helpful to talk about the therapeutic container or vessel, and something about boundaries there, because, as I do training in different counseling approaches and therapies, there's a real kind of uptightedness around maintaining the therapeutic relationship and the boundaries around that, and a lot of fear of intimacy or openness. And I'm hearing James Hillman in my head right now saying Eros needs to be present in the therapy. But
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about that vessel and how we can honor that, what's healthy in the professional and the everyday therapy.
Okay, in the professional therapy, I think that the idea of a vessel is heightened because As I understand it anyway, professional therapy is really a very special, a special activity. And it, like anything that's special, it needs its temenos. A temenos means the sacred space, the limit, the boundaries of the sacred space. So let's say a temple. The temenos might be outside the temple, but it'll be a space clearly that is separate from the secular space. I think that, to me, the clearest example, you go into a church. I don't care if you're a believer or not, makes no difference. You're just, let's say you're walking on the streets of Toronto or New York, or maybe Vancouver, and you pass a big cathedral, and you'll notice how big the doors are. If it's a traditional cathedral, they have these big doors, often in a Gothic arch or a Roman arch. They're thick. They have layers. They show different layers of the door or the arch. All of that to help you make the transition from going outside in the ordinary world into the special realm, the holy space of the interior, the inner sanctum. And usually those doors are quite effective. They simply are effective. They're heavy. You have to push them open. You have to go through a big doorway, and you get inside. It's silent. It's quieter. It smells different.
Mm-hmm.
It's another space where things can happen that couldn't happen just a few feet away outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the creation of a temenos. Churches are very good at doing it. And I think a lot of other aspects of culture need a temenos and would really be well advised to have good doors. I think hospitals are an example because you're entering a space of healing or health. It's different from the outside world. And if your space was dedicated to that, I think it would be more effective at the healing process. If your hospital interior is secular, you don't have much of a chance, really.
Mm-hmm.
You really can't heal. So it's the same thing in therapy, psychotherapy. I'm not suggesting they have to have a big church door in order to get into your room. But it wouldn't hurt to have a door and some way of indicating that you have entered a special space of some kind. It's not the same space that you use for everything. It gets really handy if you go to a therapist and you go into that therapist's room, and it's a dedicated room to either only therapy or only reflective activity. Like for me, if you come into my space, you're going to be in the space of a writer and a therapist, nothing else. It's not a business room. Mm-hmm. It's a room of writing and therapy. And I think that helps. And so I put things in my room that are going to evoke the therapy, a lot of statues, as Freud did, statues of the gods, and especially the gods of healing. But I also have St. Thomas More in my room. And paintings of my wife. And I think if you go in there, you see that it's a special space and that I've entered a temenos. If you could, and that's something you feel, you sense. It's not abstract. It's not in your head. You feel it or you don't. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to create the vessel. Another way is by paying for the time. So the payment might be like in the old days, people would bring a chicken for sacrifice to the temple of Asclepius, but we don't bring chickens anymore. We bring money. That's fine. Money is a substitute for other things. It helps create the temenos and also supports the temple where you are and the priest of the temple, priestess. So all of that makes a lot of sense to me as creating the temple, the temenos, the vessel, if you want to call it that. And other things, it might be assurance that give assurance that's real, that what's said here is private, that you are capable of maintaining the privacy of the conversation. And if you do that, you are making your vessel even tighter. Mm-hmm. Making that explicit, I think, is a good idea. And there are other things too you could do, I'm sure, that I just don't think of at the moment, to help create a vessel between you. that is felt, that's real. And in that, you're like in an alchemical chamber where things can happen.
Yeah. One of the things I've been doing since I've been doing more sessions with people over Zoom is, it occurred to me after doing it for a little while that I wanted more of that temenos feeling, because I imagined that if the person came over, they would come into my little room, I would light a candle, I'd burn some incense, and there would be that whole sensory experience that, okay, this is a special place, right? We're going to shift into a different mode here. So what I started to do was at the beginning of the sessions is light a candle, burn some incense, and encourage the person on the other end to do that as well, and try to create that space between us regardless of where they are in the world.
That sounds really good. Yeah, sounds very, very good. Those activities like that, things you do like that, as I said about the doors, can be very physical and very effective. I think it's also valuable to have more subtle ways. It's as though the vessel does have that part of it. And I advocate that so strongly, that we do make it physical. At the same time, in this book, I wanted to point out that the vessel also has these subtle, like the way you use language, the way you comport yourself, the way you conduct your business, all of those things also add to the structure of your vessel.
Mm-hmm. Now, so taking that idea and transferring it over to the quote unquote therapist, I think about when we ask someone out for a coffee or a drink. Is that a kind of unconscious, subtle way of creating a sacred space for a deeper conversation?
I think it could go either way.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think the intention probably is, yes. And food, I think, does certainly does intensify the sacredness of the place and the depth, allows communication, to talking, or drink too. Um, the only problem is that sometimes if you go to a restaurant, let's say, or a coffee shop, it doesn't have enough of the sacred space that you need or the privacy that you need. So you have to take in a lot of different things into account. The trouble is if you say, let's go to I know a place where there's a room with no windows, we can just sit there undisturbed. That probably won't foster communication either. That's too
Yeah.
literal that way. So I think you just have to be artful about it and figure out what would be a place to go that will give us our privacy, our specialness. This is not just going for coffee, but at the same time is not overly precious that way.
Yeah, not formalized. Yeah. Yeah, I think about the kind of spaces that we have access to here in North America, and a real dearth of those kind of public spaces that do have some soul in them, like, where you can find a dark corner in the pub or in the coffee shop. I'm remembering James Hillman talking about this story about, I think it was like a worker in New Delhi who, after a long day of sweeping the streets, he would ride his bicycle, 50 kilometers across the city to go have coffee with his friends because they love that conversation so much. I think about things like that, and I think about the kind of design of spaces in North America, and it just doesn't evoke that for me.
No, it's funny. We were talking about Ireland. In Ireland, and I think in England to some extent as well, going to the pub, is not like going to a bar. I don't know where it is where you live, but where I live, a bar is a little darker place. It's not really a place of communication as much as it is in England and Ireland, Scotland. I would, so People are fortunate that they have places they can go. Now, those places are often very communal and it'd be hard to find a quiet spot. But they do have places in those pubs called snugs. They're just usually little places with a curtain or a door on them, so you can go in and just maybe 5 or 6 people can get in them and be cut off from the rest of the. I've gone into those places for private conversations. I've gone into a snug before, many times actually, for conversations. On the other hand, and I think I mentioned this in the book, I had a client years ago who was in another state, and another location, and he had to fly to see me. He really wanted to come to do this therapy with me. So he would fly in, and I forget why he couldn't come to my place, but I would meet him at the airport and we would find a quiet spot at the airport, and it was really fine. We were able to do excellent work just in a corner of the airport. So when I talk about vessels, sometimes you have to make it with, kind of just with the little bit you've got, you try to make that space special.
Mm. Yeah, and talking about those more subtle qualities, you do go into that more deeply in the book, but you talk about the way that we're speaking, the attention that we place on the words that we're using, because in that sacred space, in that context, the power of our language is elevated or amplified. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. What I do, I don't know if anyone else thinks of it this way, but I consider the speech of therapy almost like being on stage. It's not natural. It's not just ordinary language. We're not just speaking the way we speak in everyday life. It's a special communication and or conversation. And so I figure it begins with the first engagement with the person when you first meet them coming to the very end when they're going away. That it's a bit of a drama. And what we're doing there is, I think when you speak to the soul, you are speaking in a special way that has to address the soul in that ordinary life. So I'm very cautious of everything I say from the beginning to the end. And cautious, I don't mean anxious about it, but I'm aware that it's not the same as regular life. I listen
Careful, maybe.
carefully. Hmm?
You're careful in what
Yeah,
you
I'm
say.
careful, and uh, I interpret what I hear, and I speak in such a way that I know that this is going to have more power. Each word will have more power because of the context.
Hmm. Yeah, you talk about that, how when we're in that therapist role, anything we say can really set the patient or the friend off, depending on what they're carrying from their past history. So something we think could be really innocuous, or could just be like the thing to really trigger them. So just
That's,
honoring that, that's what's going on is
yes,
important.
yes, because everything's at a heightened level, and that's good because that means it will address the soul and not just be taken literally. It'll have a deeper resonance to it, but that means it also it could cause some trouble because it's in that deeper place.
Hmm. Something else that you raised that might be completely unfamiliar to anyone who's not a trained psychotherapist is the concept of transference, and that's been one of the concepts that's been hardest for me to grasp. I think I'm getting it more and more as I get more experienced in the counseling work that I do. I'm seeing it more clearly. But and I think the way that you explain it in the book is one of the clearest, most relatable ways I've ever read. So maybe if you could speak about that, because I think it is really important and it does show up in all of our relationships.
It does. So it's a very classic idea. The Freudians, especially psychoanalysts, have classic psychoanalysts, especially, have written a great deal about transference. Jung wrote a lot about it. He wrote a book, a special book, a book dedicated to the idea of transference. It's called The Psychology of the Transference. I've read it maybe 25 times, I think, because I never quite get everything out of it. It's entirely alchemical. So if you don't know any alchemy, it'd be pretty hard to follow. But I think it's quite interesting. And Hillman's written, referred to a transference here and there. I don't remember him writing specifically addressing transference very much, but I could be wrong. But anyway, the way I see it, and this is following Hillman, is that when two people get together, no matter when and where, it's like a cloak. They bring clouds of fantasy with them. They're just clouds. They're like in a fog. They're full of fantasy, different colors and everything, because so many different images from all different times of their own life and people they've met and things they've gone through. It's just all with us when we meet somebody.
Yeah, even like films and books we've read,
Anything.
it's all
It's
there,
all
right?
there. It's all there. Especially books we read, because we'll have ideas and themes and characters that will be with us.
Well, right now I think I'm having an Obi-Wan Kenobi transference to you. You
Watch
know,
out for that one.
yeah, the wise old man, right? Oh,
Yeah. So yeah, so we can have all kinds of, so we have all that potential, but you have to understand with transfers, there's a lot going on. It's not simple. Now, sometimes the way people describe transference, and I think it's legitimate as far as it goes, is that we have had very special relationships with our parents as children. And those relationships stay with us. I think that's true. Those patterns, they are the first patterns of our lives, and they really have a big influence on who we are. And they do stay with us. So the classical idea would be that it's about therapy. So you go to a therapist, let's say you go to a male therapist, you're a man or a woman, you go to this male therapist. And right away, you start relating to that therapist as your father. I mean, that's kind of a classical way of looking at it. And what you've done is transferred patterns and images of your father to the therapist. And the idea is that in therapy then is that the therapist can deal with those transferences effectively and is skillful with them, and therefore can help a person not be so limited by those fantasies of the father. Or the mother, could be a mother thing too. But what I'm describing here is much broader than that. So it's not just about mother and father, and it's not just about bringing over your mother and father into the current, your personal mother and father into the current relationship. Jung himself says very, very clearly, and I quote him in the book, he says that what we transfer from the past to the present is not our parents, but the images of father and mother that we first met with our parents. That's a different thing. So it's those images that we then transfer and find in a person in our present lives. We might transfer, I would say you might transfer your brother, your uncle, your grandfather, some teacher, a person you met somewhere. You see something that reminds you or that excites this older fantasy of yours, and it has a role in your relationship, the current relationship. It influences the current relationship. Like you relate to this current person in ways that you related to the person that you met before. But I'll repeat this, Jung says it's not the person in the past you transfer. It's not personal. It's the archetypal figure that you encountered in the past that you now meet in this other person, qualified and colored by your experience, perhaps of your mother or father or somebody else. But it's archetypal primarily.
yeah. So one of, the way I experience it quite a bit is it's not actually, and you can correct me on this if this is if there's a difference between projection and transference. But what I often find is that it may not be the qualities that my own father embodied, but it could be maybe the qualities that he didn't embody that I'm then projecting on an older
Yeah,
man or teacher.
yes. I will say to you, I don't mean to be fussy, but I will be. um, Hillman says that we don't project, the psyche projects. And I think what he meant to say that, and what I do, if you notice in the book, I'm very cautious with my use of language there. So what I say is that we meet those figures later on. We don't project them. We meet those archetypal figures within somebody else. Instead of thinking that I'm doing all this projecting, it's me, it's personal coming out of me onto them. No, these archetypal figures have an existence of their own. This is sort of a Platonic aspect of this psychology. They have a kind of existence of their own. And so mother and father, I might meet father, the fathering that goes on in life, I might meet anywhere and anybody. And so that's what I might do, then I might find this fathering once again. And you might bring over some of that stuff from your own father because you met the father there pretty powerfully, and that might influence how you see the father in this case. But there are probably a lot of other influences too. So, but the key is that if two people talking to each other, one trying to be of some assistance, and you have to know that this person will probably see you as somebody, the wise old man, if you want, somebody, and that will be a transference. See the difference between that and projection?
I
It's
think
not the
so.
same.
It's why it's so hard for me to wrap my head around, because there's that subtlety there.
Well, you have to, I think the start, one thing Hillman says, it's a matter of it's a matter of they, not we. It's them.
Help me out with that.
Okay, so it's I meet, okay, in my father, I have discovered, for good or bad, I have discovered a certain way in which the human possibility of father in life finds, finds expression and is embodied. I see that in my father. But this idea of the father, I might find a whole different aspect of that in somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
This person might relate to me in such a way that I feel fathered, but it's not at all like what my personal father did. So we're talking there about a fathering that goes on. It's more like a verb, like a fathering that's taking place. And that is, there's no projection involved of I'm
Mm-hmm. I get
projecting
you.
something on somebody. I am meeting the father. This
Another
is
aspect
somebody
of
else.
another aspect of the father.
Yes,
Yeah. In that way, we're often attracted to people who carry some of those missing qualities to help us fill out that image of fathering.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and to have a broader, greater experience of fathering.
And I think,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, Hilma would say that that's one of the purposes of therapy. Therapy can help you expand so that you're not limited to that and suffering that particular father image.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of that thing that Jung said about it's not so much that we solve our problems as we outgrow them by expanding our capacity and experience. So the more fathering you experience out in the world, the the more diminished that father complex in you, or like the resentment toward the father, the more diminished that becomes in contrast to your expanded view of fathering.
It's a liberation, really, and often to find another kind of fathering that is not so
Mm.
difficult.
Oh, it's a blessing, you know. And I had a relationship like that with one of my teachers. I knew nothing of transference, even less than I know now. But looking back, I can see that he was he was offering another experience of fathering, able to relate to me on the spiritual level and things like that, and offer me a blessing and a kind of mentorship that my own father couldn't do, just because my own father had different interests and capacities. So in receiving that from someone else, I think around that time it was when I started to drop all the resentment toward my own father because of his limitations and all of that, all the things I didn't get from him. And then I could focus on all of the really great things that I did get from him.
Well, Hillman also made a big point in several of his writings and in his speeches, his talks, that the absent father and the weak and ineffective father can give us a great deal as well.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I was talking to a client too, and he's at the point where he's not able to see a lot of the good stuff that he got from his father. But even in the kind of negative lesson that he gets from his father, his father not waking up and becoming more conscious and fulfilling his life's dreams and all of that, even that is a valuable lesson that his father is carrying for him and living for him. Like his father is suffering in order that he could get that lesson, even if it's in a kind of negative way.
Yeah, so Hillman thought that he wrote about it quite a bit, that the father who is not able to do much and is empty and ineffective can be useful, because you do learn a great deal from that. You get a great deal from that negativity. So he didn't want to just say we have to have wonderful fathers. That's not the point. That the father is there and has good side and bad side and fullness and emptiness, and you draw a lot from that, and then it affects the way you deal with other people then who seem to have to evoke the father in your future. And also, if you have the role of being father in the future, then it will be affected by that.
Mm. Hmm. Something else that I want to touch on. I know I'm watching the time, but something else that may feel, oh, how would I say this? So the whole chapter you've got on symptoms and this particular approach to working with symptoms, and you mentioned Patricia Berry, who's James Hillman's first wife, I believe, but who's kind of a unsung hero of archetypal psychology. I think that would be really important to talk about that because it is a unique approach to working with symptoms.
At this point, I don't know who said it first. I remember when I was living in Dallas and hanging out with Jim and Pat, and I mean the Hillmans and a lot of other colleagues. I don't know where it really came up. I don't know if Hillman said it or if Pat Berry did it. She wrote about it, certainly. And he mentions it in some of his books. We called it going with a symptom. That's what we referred to all the time. I remember once doing a workshop with Hillman. He and I led a workshop there. I don't remember where it was, but we talked a lot about symptoms, and this came up. We talked a great deal about going with the symptom. So I know that that was his way of looking at it. And I've taken it on for myself. I think it's very valuable, but it's a little mysterious because what we do is if someone presents a problem, what we do is tend to try to respect the problem and not reach immediately for a solution that will be sort of at the opposite end of the problem, quite different. So for example, you meet someone, you're working with someone who hates the fact that she feels so dependent on other people and would love to be more independent. And she might say to you, could you help me become a more independent person?
Oh, geez. I lost you again there. Sorry.
But our approach approach is to go with the symptoms. So we're not interested in how to
Sorry,
become what's going on.
sorry, Tom. It's broken
Is
up
that right?
again. Yeah, so we had an interruption there, but if you could pick it up, talking about going with the symptom.
This is an idea that the people around Hillman used to talk about a lot. And he and I gave workshops where we would discuss with people at great length how to deal with symptoms. And the idea of going with the symptom is a bit mysterious and maybe radical in some ways, in some places. So ordinarily, we have a tendency to want to correct and go to the opposite side of the symptom, the presenting problem. So let's say someone says, I tend to be too dependent on other people. I need to really get in charge of my life and do what I want to do. Could you help me become more independent? Well, I might say yes, but what I really mean, what I know is that I'm going to go into that symptom of dependency. That's what I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to try to cheerlead this person toward independence and try to find ways in which she could become more independent. Because what that does, it goes against the symptom. And the thing is, the way it works is, the way I see it anyway, is that this is the way Jung describes it as well, that our symptoms really have two parts, two poles. And one tends to be invisible and the other very visible. So dependency might be very visible and problematical, but independence might be present and be more symptomatic as well. Therefore, a lot of times you find people who are kind of weak and passive and dependent can also be very controlling, almost without, they don't even know it maybe, or they may, but they may not. And it usually is not upfront, it's not clear.
Yeah, you give that example in the book of the woman who feels manipulated, and you talked about how she may be surreptitiously exerting some power. And I had a hard time like really grasping how someone who is more passive and dependent, how they could be kind of covertly asserting their power. Can you give a concrete example of how that might show up?
Well, I don't know if you've known people who are quite passive and quiet and kind of let things go. They don't stand up for themselves much. And yet, in other circumstances, might be very controlling of somebody else, very trying to insistent on them going in certain directions. You see this sometimes, let's say, in a parent, like let's say a mother who is very quiet and doesn't speak up much, but she finds ways to make sure that her kids are really under her thumb. And so maybe her husband as well. And vice versa. It could be the man doing that with the woman. It's usually not very clear. You have to look closely to see it.
Mm.
The trouble then is if the therapist starts emphasizing this power, all you're doing is making things worse.
Mm. Yeah, as you're kind of going deeper into that, I'm thinking about if someone is very passive in a relationship, like, this may be my experience, maybe somebody I know, but in being very passive about, say, decision making, like where are we going to go for, what are we going to do for dinner, where are we going to go for
Yes,
vacation, you're forcing the other person to make the decisions and to take the initiative on things. And so that is a kind of shadow uh, power of some kind, right?
that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I think the word I was looking for when I brought up this topic was escaping me at the moment, thanks to Mercury,
Yeah.
is it seems counterintuitive because when we think, well, I've got symptoms, that's why I go to therapy is to deal with the symptoms, to cope with the symptoms, and pray to God, get rid of the symptoms.
Well, I really try to help that too. I also want to get rid of the symptoms in a way, but I don't believe the best way is by uh, supporting moving into that opposite place from where the symptom. I mean, by supporting by yeah, moving into the opposite place. I don't think that does it. So for example, let's say someone who doesn't show is quite passive, doesn't show much spark, when it comes to living his own life. What we could do in exploring that, find out its roots. You always want to find the narrative. That's why my book begins with a couple of chapters on story. Uh, we have to find the narrative. And that helps. That opens it up a bit, and we have material to work with. And when you do that, you find out more about that passivity and that weakness. You find out maybe where, in a way, what the origins are, at least the narrative origins are of it, where the person thinks, oh, it was my dad who kept putting me down every time I tried to be somebody. That's a story I hear a lot. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that gives it something. But then what we can do as the more we know about it, we can find out ways that that person can be more flexible and vulnerable. So passivity gets transformed into flexibility and vulnerability. Let's say we use different words because now, as we work at this symptom, it changes. It becomes something more positive, something we can live with anyway. And then when you've got that in place, then the strength is not a reaction against passivity. Now you can also be really strong because strength and vulnerability are very close to each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to be courageous, feel strong in order to be vulnerable.
Exactly. To be vulnerable, you got to be pretty strong.
Be willing to take a shot, right?
Exactly. Exactly. But when you are passive and when your strength only shows itself in trying to control everybody, which isn't real strength, it's fear.
Mm-hmm.
Going,
Yeah. What do
yeah.
you think? I always think when something like that comes up, like say passivity, uh, where I immediately get curious is around like, what are you getting from being passive? I always look for like because I think people always kind of choose these ways of being or behaviors for a certain reason. They get something from it. So passivity, what I get is a feeling of safety. I don't have to put myself out there and take risks. Other people are making decisions for me, right? So yeah, you think there's value in that?
Oh yes. Any time you can take the presenting symptom, whatever that is, and can uh, uh, examine it and open it up more, see what it's made of, see what its history is, see what it means to the person experiencing it. All of that helps a lot because then you've got material that you can work with. It goes back to Jung's idea, which is another interesting idea that in order for therapy to happen, you need what he called, using alchemical language, prima materia, raw material. You need the raw material. And if all you got are a few ideas in the sense of your client saying, well, I'm passive, that doesn't really give us any material. That's an idea from them, but give me some material. When did this happen? When do you experience it? Who are you when you go through this? What are the different uh, forms of expression it takes?
Mhm.
Then you get material, and then you have something to work with, and it becomes more complicated. And when you've got that, you can start seeing it will begin to change in shape as you do it. Like I said, changing from passivity to flexibility. And
Hmm.
then the strength part of it is not far away, because once you're flexible now, you can be stronger.
Right. Yeah. Right. So when more kind of assertiveness or decisiveness comes online, they've already got the gift of being able to let go of control. Like that
Yes,
was their dominant mode before. So they've already got that skill or
that's
that
right.
gift. And now we're just adding to it, and that creates that flexibility you're talking
That's
about,
right.
right?
They come together. Jung called that the mysterium conjunctionis, the mystery of the conjunction. You bring these two things together that were far apart. It's the conjunction that's important, bringing them together.
Yeah, well, I've heard that term a million times, but that real world kind of example of how that might be expressed um, helps bring it home for me.
Yeah.
um, I think, before we end, I'm studying dream tending with Steve Eisenstadt.
Yes.
Easy for me to say. I still can't say his name. Steve at Pacifica.
Yeah.
And he very much follows James Hillman's way
Yes.
of working with dreams, which is why I chose to study with him. And you talk about dreams in the book. And I think that's another place where we can really do some soul care in everyday life. And that it is something that's really been lost in our culture, is that daily ritual of waking up and sharing your dream with your friend or your family member.
Right. So this is probably what Steve taught you, but let me say just a couple of things about the dream work then. I think the most important thing is, and this is right out of Hillman, don't don't come up with a solution to a dream. Don't aim to get a solution. Don't get the final interpretation. You can experiment certainly with experimentation with interpretations of images and things like that. But Hillman was very much against the idea of seeing the dream images as symbols, that one thing stands for another. It's very tempting to be totally symbolic about dreams. And his warning, I think, is very helpful, because what it comes down to, when two people, let's say, who are not, neither of them therapists or dream workers of any kind, when they come together, all they have to do is say, I had a dream last night. And they tell the dream as they had it, as close as they can to the dream. A lot of people just make a generic statement about the dream. That doesn't work. You have to know the dream as you had it, as faithfully as you can. And the other person might say, well, it reminds me a little bit of this thing, or they're not interpreting the dream or the dream symbols. They're saying, this is what comes to mind when I hear that dream. And in relation to you, I notice something. I can tell it's your dream because this is what I hear in it. That kind of conversation is really good for dream work, good kind of dream work. The other kind, which so many people want to get into, symbol reading and knowing, like, using all Jungian, that's an anima figure, this is shadow.
Mm.
That all of that tends to take away from the dream imagery. So what it matter what it is, even the Freudian thing, that's a phallic image, which I say that's fine to say those things, but don't see them as interpretations. Say them, they might be able to give you some idea about the image, but say it and then let it go. Say it
Mhm.
and don't make that your final reading. Keep going at the images and keep them alive.
Mm. Yeah, Hillman would often say things. He was great because he said things so strongly. He never
Yeah,
seemed to have a fear of offending anyone.
no,
In
no.
fact, he seemed to rejoice in it. But he would say, if the black snake visits you in your dream, as soon as you say black snake equals dark mother or devouring mother, you've killed the snake.
Yeah, that's right.
I just love that because it honors the dream image, as a living
Yes.
entity.
But what I might say is that, well, we know about a little bit about snakes. We know about the snake in Eden, the Garden of Eden. We know about the snake that was the goddess Asclepios of healing. We know that snake. We know quite a few snakes in mythology and imagery. they can maybe help us a little bit, but this snake is not one of those snakes.
Hmm.
This is the snake of this dream, and we have to keep that snake alive and not make it into something else.
Yeah. That's helpful because I've been trying to find this balance because part of me does find value in looking at what images represent symbolically.
Yeah.
But another part of me doesn't want to kind of kill the dream in a way because as soon as I say, oh, that dream is about that, it's like I'm done with it. I can wipe my hands clean. I can move
That's
on
the
to the
trouble.
next thing, right?
Yeah, that's the trouble. It also gives you a sense of conquering, which you
Right. That
can't do.
heroic, like I've got this dream figured out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a bit of an ego push, and you don't need that. With a dream, you should leave it quite neutral.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, you said something in the book that I really loved. Become a priest of the dream world, not its conqueror.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So not like Heracles going down into Hades and causing a bunch of
Yeah.
trouble and havoc.
No, you don't need to bring your sword with you. No, you can come and as a person, like a poet, like an artist, like Orpheus, who was a musician. You go down and you go down into that realm and you come up singing about it.
Mm, yeah. Beautiful. Okay, we've got to wrap up, but we've ended up talking about so many kind of male figures in the course of our conversation that I'd be remiss if we didn't invoke Aphrodite, who you places in a very central role in therapy. Can you just like give us a few words on Aphrodite and her place in therapy?
Yes, Aphrodite, known by the Romans as Venus, uh, is is so important. She is an aspect, it's a kind of an embodiment of what Jung referred to as anima or a soul figure. So she represents a certain way, I think, as a psychopomp. I think it's through Aphrodite and Venus that we could bring soul into our world, certainly into our culture. Our incredible, complex, and feverish concern about sexuality lets us know that's one of our big symptoms. Lets
Mm.
us know that there's a lot of material there that has to be redeemed. And I think we redeemed that through Aphrodite, who is known as the goddess of sexuality and sensuality, beauty, the beautiful aspects of nature, um, passion, um, relationship to some extent, not marriage really, but a lot of these other things. These are the things that our world is very confused about and acting out all over the place. And Hillman wrote about that a lot, as I have. Dark Eros is one of my books about the need for the erotic life. And I think that Aphrodite then is, the reason I mentioned her as an aspect of anima is that she could be the bridge to soul in our life. That means looking at our sexuality and not trying to be so moralistic about it so we come out right with it and feeling okay about it, but to see its mysteries and what it really is at a deep level and what we're really talking about with our sexuality, because we usually think of it too literally and only about what to do, what not to do, rather than to see
And
that
who to do it with,
and
what
who
not
to
to do
do
it
it
with.
with, rather than being sexual. I agree with Freud that everything we do in life is sexual, that there's a sexual matter dynamic in it. That means Aphrodite is present. So Plotinus, the great philosopher of the soul, said that the world is full of Aphrodite. I think that's where we are. That Aphrodite is there to bring our world to life. If we could do, I think because we don't recognize her, we are in a way at the mercy of Mars or Ares of the violets, at mercy of violets, and Aphrodite could help us with that violence.
Mm. Yeah, you spoke about the word, or you highlighted the word interest earlier. And it's
Yes, I did.
funny,
Yes.
I'm kind of a student of words. I find words contain so many teachings in them. And I was looking up the word interest the other day. I was doing some writing and I was
Mhm.
interested in the word interest. And, one of the roots is intéresse, which means to the being in between.
Yes,
And when you're,
two Latin words, actually. They're just two Latin words, inter est.
and I was thinking about the French, but yeah, it's obviously just a reflection of the
Imagine,
Latin.
imagine.
But I was thinking, as you're talking about Aphrodite, that perhaps it's Aphrodite who is the being in between. So the one that draws us into relationship with others, relationship with the world, and her quality of appreciation, beauty, enamored. That's what draws us into relationship with the world and other people. And in the therapeutic relationship, so going back to that essence of unconditional positive regard, or love for the soul of the other.
Yes. Yes, we take an interest in that's a starting point. We take an interest in the people that we are speaking to therapeutically. We take an interest in them and their lives and their situation. If you don't have an interest in it, nothing happens. It's an erotic word, as you say. It's an erotic word. It's a thing between. So they're very closely related to Hermes, though, and there we get the hermaphrodite, which is the two
Oh, I
guys.
never, I never even put, I never put that together. But there you go.
And that's according to another wonderful archetypal psychologist, Rafael López-Pedraza. He says in his book on Hermes that we need to arrive at the hermaphrodite in order to bring soul to life. That means we have to be there between Hermes and Aphrodite, both of whom are interested, in the sense that they are the go-betweens. They're in between,
Mm.
and that it's all based on love and pleasure and desire. It's not about your head thinking it through. It's about having a real desire and finding pleasure.
An erotic connection with life.
That's right. Absolutely, yes. And but if I can add, at the end here, one other thought that one of my favorites is I very much favor the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who's from whom we get our name Epicurean, and we mean kind of excessive pleasure, but he was not that. He was interested in desire and pleasure as the basic principle of life. That we seek pleasure, and we ought to seek pleasure, but deep pleasure, soul pleasure. So for him, the great model of pleasure was friendship.
Mm.
And he was a vegetarian. He ate modestly, but eating was important to him. Food was important to him, but not in excess. So to me, to be an Epicurean is to live in this world with its pleasures and take them on. That is Aphrodite. And that's Hermes. That's being a hermaphrodite as well, to be Epicurean. And so I kind of dedicate my life to that Epicurean principle and goal. I feel that having life's deep, ordinary pleasures is much more important than we think.
Well, I love that Epicurus was actually a vegetarian, because then it keeps us from taking it too literally, that it's about taking pleasure in this rich, complicated food or whatever, that we can look at it more as food for the soul. And I think that's
Yes, it's
something that
pleasure.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's pleasure, but it doesn't have to be excessive. People right away think hedonism when you use the word pleasure. It's
Right.
unfortunate because pleasure is so important. I gave a lecture in London once called voluptas, which is a Latin word for pleasure, and one of the minor goddesses of Aphrodite, around Aphrodite, This is so important, as we were saying before about Aphrodite being important. Pleasure is part of that.
Mm. Well, I hope people have received some pleasure from this conversation. I know it's been food for my soul. And so I want to thank you again and for being so generous with your time and continuing to write books that can guide us, you know.
I'll do my best.
If I could be so bold, as I was listening to your latest book, I had the idea that, boy, I would really love it if if Thomas could write a book of like teaching stories or therapeutic myths that offers some of these mythological stories, because I do think it's really helpful to have a background in Greek mythology, but there's never been, as far as I know, an anthology of myths that are um, put in relation to life and life's difficulties, and I would, if I could have some kind of anthology like that of like these teaching stories or therapeutic myths, I think that would be so helpful to us.
Mm. Well, thank you for that idea. I will really take it seriously. I will say that the next book that's finished. It's already finished, been finished for months and months.
Wow.
In my desk somewhere, is called Tales of Emptiness. So what I've done there is taken stories from around the world of emptiness. There are these stories that just like about an empty pot or about someone not showing up, or Oscar Wilde has an empty plate should have sandwiches on it. There are all these stories of emptiness from around the world, and what I've done is taken them and try to show how each one points to a certain truth about the way we live, that we need that kind of emptiness. I can imagine something similar in mythology.
Mm. Okay, well, I'll just plant that seed and
Okay, good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
thanks
I've
again,
written
Tom.
some books before where people said, why don't you do this? And I went ahead and did it, sat right down and did it.
Yeah, well, look, if I can count on anyone to produce another book on mythology and therapy and soul, it's you. You just have an endless amount of energy for this. It's amazing.
I do.
Well, thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. Brian, I appreciate it very much. It's so easy to talk to you. Uh, you know what we're talking about. That's so nice, and have a nice, accepting and open way of talking. So I appreciate it.
Oh, great. Maybe we can do it when the next book comes out.
Sure.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.